Mr. President, it started sounding too familiar to me. I've been involved in public policy debates for a long time on Capitol Hill about big tobacco, about nicotine in cigarettes, about the public health consequences of smoking. It's a personal issue, of course, for me and for so many of us. Our families have been touched by tobacco-related disease and death. I lost my father to lung cancer. He was 53 years old, 2 packs of Camels a day. I stood by his bedside when I was just a high school student and saw what tobacco could do. And so when I was elected to Congress, I decided to try to take on big tobacco. It wasn't an easy task. They had very many friends in high places and made it clear in both political parties in the House of Representatives that tobacco was untouchable. Well, I offered an amendment quite a few years ago now to ban smoking on airplanes. It was really because of my irritation and strong feelings that the people who were on the plane who were non-smokers shouldn't have to breathe in secondhand smoke. To my surprise, we passed it in the House by a handful of votes, even though the leadership in both political parties opposed it. And then it came over here, and Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey passed it as well. It became the law of the land. Neither Frank nor I could have predicted what would happen next, but as the American people noticed that secondhand smoke was taken off airplanes, they started asking obvious questions about why wouldn't you take it off of trains and buses, offices, hospitals, restaurants, on and on. The net result was a change across America when it came to standards for smoking and tobacco cigarettes. And then I enlisted a group that was showing extraordinary leadership in Washington called the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. Matt Myers, the director, still works for that organization. And we went to the heart of the issue, and that was the fact that big tobacco was doing its best to make teenagers customers. They had to. They were losing too many of their best customers who were dying because of their product. So they tried to addict children, and they were successful. They had ad campaigns, Joe Camel ads, the Marlboro Cowboy, all sorts of cartoon figures, really appealing to children. And it worked. They were able to replenish their smokers with kids who started smoking at earlier age. Well, we went after them, and eventually there was a national lawsuit against the tobacco companies. We changed the standards for selling tobacco in America, made it much more difficult for kids to get their hands on cigarettes, and over time reduced the percentage of kids who were using these tobacco products. Well, the tobacco companies faced a dilemma. They were losing their best customers, the kids. What were they going to do to maintain their profits? It became pretty obvious several years ago. They'd found an alternative product called e-cigarettes and vaping. And what was good about this was they could make health claims about e-cigarettes and vaping. They could argue that since you're taking tobacco out of the equation, merely sucking in some form of nicotine vapor was preferable from a health perspective. And yet, when it came right down to it, there was no proof of that whatsoever. Juul is the biggest e-cigarette maker, vaping device maker in America, and their full-page ads in newspaper after newspaper made these health claims that, in fact, e-vaping was a healthy alternative to tobacco cigarettes. No proof, none. And then something else started happening. We started noticing that all across America, kids, the same kids who once used to be the targets of big tobacco, were now the targets of big vaping. Vaping targets kids. The numbers tell the story. 2 years ago, 11% of high school students in America were vaping. A year later, 20%. Today, 27%. More than 1 out of 4 high school students are using e-cigarettes and vaping today. And even worse, 10% of middle school students, 10, 11, 12 years old, are vaping. The numbers are growing, and you wonder why. Well, the people in the vaping industry know how to target kids. They target them with flavors designed just for kids. Razzle Dazzle Berry, Gummy Bears, Bubble Gum, Unicorn Milk. How many 50-year-old chain smokers can't wait to get unicorn milk flavoring for their vaping device? It's all about kids. And the vaping industry, despite all their public denials, have targeted these kids and effectively recruited our children to be the next generation of vapors for life. How much nicotine's in that little vaping device? The one that looks like it's a flash drive for your computer? The equivalent amount of nicotine in vaping as in a total pack of cigarettes, 20 cigarettes, you get with one hit on a vaping device. And nicotine is a very addictive chemical. I know from my family experience, and we all know from those who try for long, long times to quit using tobacco cigarettes, the nicotine draws them back time and time again. So this addiction was underway, and I started writing letters, which senators do, protesting to the Food and Drug Administration and Surgeon General and anyone else who would listen that this vaping epidemic was dangerous. Dangerous for our kids and dangerous for our future. It took the longest time to get their attention. In fact, with this new Trump administration, they initially postponed any action against vaping until the year 2022, beyond the president's first term. Well, I went to Dr. Gottlieb, who then was head of the FDA, and said, you can't wait 4 years. You've got to do something right now about vaping. He resisted for a while, but then he came around. He held a press conference, and you know what he called this vaping situation? An epidemic. The head of the Food and Drug Administration, medical doctor Gottlieb, called it an epidemic. So then he left for family reasons, and he had a successor, Dr. Ned Sharpless, acting commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And I appealed to him, saying, do something. You have the power right now to take all of these children's flavors, off the market for vaping. You could do it today. And secondly, you could ban most of the vaping devices, which have never been approved by the government. He didn't want to do it, dragged his feet. It went on for months. But I'll have to say, in all candor and honesty, last week there was a breakthrough. Last week, the Trump administration addressed this issue directly. Last Monday, the Food and Drug Administration said to Juul, the major manufacturer, stop making health claims you can't prove. Stop telling people that your product is a healthy alternative to tobacco cigarettes. There are no clinical trials. There is no proof, no study, credible medical study that you can point to make that claim. So stop saying it. And then, just a couple days later, they went even further, banning the use of these flavors that have enticed children into vaping and e-cigarettes. They've announced that probably within 30 days, as their estimate, these are all going to have to come off the market. In May of next year, the companies that make them can apply to come back on the market if they can prove they are good for public health. Well, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Republican, and I have had a bill for several months now on this issue. I thank her for her bipartisan cooperation in this effort. It's great to have her by my side. She's a terrific ally. She and I believe that none of these flavors should come back on the market until it's proven that they are not dangerous to children and that they, in fact, do help adults stop smoking and can show positive results. I think that's a hard measure, a hard standard for them to meet, and it should be, because the alternative is unacceptable. More children addicted to e-cigarettes and vaping. There may be a place for e-cigarettes some point in the future. I'm not sure where it will be. But as long as they are endangering our children with their products and their flavors, I'm going to continue to fight their efforts. And I want to say something else. Even in the midst of my battles against big tobacco, I still remember what my dad went through when he tried to stop smoking, dying of lung cancer, trying to stop smoking. It was so hard and painful. And I watched it as a young boy and saw the struggle he went through. And I've always said we have to show some caring and compassion for the people who were once tobacco users and want to quit. And today we have to show the same level of caring when it comes to all of these high school students, 5 million American high school students who are vaping and using e-cigarettes and should quit. We need to give them a path and a recommendation. I wrote to the Surgeon General last week and asked him to come up with a plan, an education approach, to allow these young people to get off this nicotine addiction before it's too late. What's happened in the past, sadly, is that many of the high schoolers who were using e-cigarettes didn't quit completely from anything. They moved to tobacco cigarettes with the nicotine they were seeking in a different form. So that's the challenge that we face. After years of inaction and a lot of telephone calls and letters and meetings, the Food and Drug Administration has done the right thing. I hope by the end of this year that these flavors will be off the shelf. And I hope that the Food and Drug Administration truly enforces what they announced last week. It's been 10 years since Congress gave the Food and Drug Administration the legal authority to regulate all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, so there's no doubt about their legal authority. Last year, 4 million children under the age of 18 were vaping in America. As I mentioned, today the number is 5 million. Over the last 2 years, we've seen a 135% increase in America's children using e-cigarettes. Ask any public health official what this means. If we didn't do something, the numbers would continue to grow, unchecked. Schools are taking doors off of toilet stalls so kids can't sneak in and use e-cigarettes and vaping between classes. Some kids are bold enough to try to do it in class. We've now linked e-cigarettes and vaping to over 380 cases of confirmed and severe respiratory illness nationwide. And as of last night in California, the 7th young person has died from vaping. We have 52 confirmed cases and 1 reported death in Illinois. But I can tell you that just yesterday morning, one of my friends, a doctor, it was Monday morning, one of my friends, a doctor in Chicago, told me in private that he had visited a major hospital and 3 young people who'd been vaping were hanging on by a thread to life. Kids as young as 15 have been hospitalized. There's no specific device or substance that's been linked to all these cases, but the one common denominator, e-cigarettes. This nicotine addiction, especially Juul's devices and what it leads to, is extraordinarily popular, with the highest levels of nicotine we've seen in products legally sold in America. Nicotine is both toxic, highly addictive, raises blood pressure, spikes adrenaline, increases the risk of heart disease. It can have short and long-term negative health impact on the developing brain particularly, including increased risk of addiction, mood disorder, permanent lowering of impulse control. And kids who use e-cigarettes are 3 times more likely than their peers to transition to traditional tobacco cigarettes. And they, of course, kill almost 500,000 Americans a year. So that's our problem, that's our challenge. I would add, too, that it's time for us to start taxing this product. For years, I've been sounding the alarm that the vaping industry is following big tobacco's playbook when it comes to appealing to our children. And I've learned over the years, in all my battles against big tobacco, that the single most effective tool to prevent children from starting the use of tobacco cigarettes is to price it out of their range. That's why we passed cigarette taxes years ago, and many states and localities followed suit. And why later this week I'll be introducing the Tobacco Tax Equity Act. This legislation will establish the first federal e-cigarette tax. It will close loopholes exploited by big tobacco to avoid the taxes. and it will double the federal tax rate and peg it to inflation so that it remains an effective public health tool in the future. Studies have shown that even a 10% tax lowers tobacco use by as much as 5%. The Surgeon General and World Health Organization have called it the most effective way to reduce tobacco use. I think the same will be true for e-cigarettes. The FDA's flavor ban announcement was an important first step. Now we need to make sure the ban is implemented quickly and that it's enforced strictly. We need the FDA to better regulate e-cigarette devices, many of which are easily tampered with and being used in conjunction with adulterated marijuana and counterfeit products. We need the Surgeon General to come up with a plan to help the millions of kids who are now addicted, and we need to start taxing e-cigarette companies who've created today's youth vaping epidemic. A movie we've seen before of big tobacco exploiting kids finally resulted in public action against those tobacco companies, and the rate of teen tobacco cigarette smoking went down dramatically. Let's not sit through that same movie again. When it comes to vaping and e-cigarettes, let's move quickly to protect our children. Mr. President, I yield the floor.